Dear students, this is The History and Culture of the Indian People, published by Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, Mumbai. Chief Editor, Professor R.C. Majumdar. Volume 1, The Vedic Age.
Chapter number 2, Sources of Indian History. It will be abundantly clear from what has been said in the previous chapter that the sources of Indian history differ considerably in its different periods. Broadly speaking, we may distinguish three such periods as follow. 1. From the most ancient times to the end of the 12th century, AD. 2. From the 13th to the 18th century, and 3. The subsequent period. It will be convenient, therefore, to treat these three periods separately. 1. The ancient period. A. Literary sources. The absence of any regular historical chronicle is the leading feature of this period. When we consider the vast mass of contemporary literature and its extremely wide range, the almost utter lack of historical texts certainly appears as a somewhat strange phenomenon. Some people are therefore inclined to believe that such literature did exist and explain its absence by a theory of wholesale destruction. It must be regarded, however, as extremely singular that the agencies of destruction should have singled out this particular branch of literature as their special target. But the strongest argument against the supposed existence of regular historical literature is the absence of any reference to historical texts. We have, therefore, to admit that the literary genius of India, so fertile and active in almost all conceivable branches of study, was not applied to chronicling the records of kings and the rise and fall of states and nations. It is difficult to give a rational explanation of this deficiency, but the fact admits of no doubt. The deficiency is all the more strange as there are indications that the ancient Indians did not lack in historical sense. This is proved by the carefully preserved lists of teachers in various Vedic texts, as well as in writings of the Buddhists, Jains, and other religious sects. That this spirit also extended to the political field is shown not only by the songs and poems in praise of kings and heroes referred to in Vedic literature, but also by the practice of reciting eulogies of kings and royal families on ceremonial occasions. Even so, late as the 7th century AD, Yuan Tsang noticed that each province in India had its own official for maintaining written records in which were mentioned good and evil events, with calamities and fortunate occurrences. That this practice continued for centuries after Yuan Tsang is proved by a large number of local chronicles and the preambles in old land grants, which record the genealogies of royal families, sometimes for several generations. We may thus presume that neither historical sense nor historical material was altogether wanting in ancient India. What was lacking was either the enthusiasm or the ability to weave the scattered raw materials into a critical historical text with a proper literary setting which the people would not willingly let die. In other words, in spite of great intellectual and literary activity, India did not produce a Herodotus or Thucydides, not even a Livy or Tacitus. It has been argued that this was partly due to the peculiar temperament of the people who, to use the words of Yuan Tsang, made light of the things of the present world. But this explanation can be hardly regarded as satisfactory when we remember the great progress of the Indians in various branches of secular literature, including law, political science, and the art of administration. Whatever may be the reason, the fact remains that the only concrete result of historical study in the most ancient period is to be found in long lists of kings preserved in the Puranas and the epics. These lists profess to trace the unbroken royal lines from the first human king that ruled down to about the 3rd or 4th century AD. The earlier part of them is obviously mythical, and the last part is undoubtedly historical. But it is a moot point to decide where the myth ends and reliable tradition begins. It is interesting to trace the gradual changes in the views of scholars regarding the historical value of these traditional royal lists preserved in the Puranas and epics. At first, they were rejected wholesale without much ceremony. Later, the accounts of the dynasties ruling in the 6th century BC and later were accepted as fairly reliable, as they were partially corroborated by the Buddhist literature and archaeological evidence. Next, the preceding dynasties going back to the time of the Great War described in the Mahabharata, which event is approximately placed in round numbers between 1500 and 1000 BC, were also regarded by some scholars as furnishing a secure basis for history, though they were loath to accept as correct all the details about names and dates. So far as the account of the royal dynasties before the Great War is concerned, Pajita was the first to make a bold attempt to coordinate the varying details into a skeleton of political history, and others have since followed in his footsteps. The difficulty of the task is increased by the strongly marked differences in the various traditions, and the conclusions reached by the few scholars who have so far worked in this field show great divergences. The attempt to reconstruct the skeleton of political history before the Great War cannot therefore be regarded as yet leading to any satisfactory result. For the period following that, 1600 BC, we have at least a working hypothesis, and it is not till we come to the beginning of the 6th century BC that we can firmly grasp the thread of the dynastic history of northern India. The traditions preserved in ancient Indian literature, notably the Puranas, thus form the main source of information for the history of the earliest period, and for the period before the 6th century BC, they constitute our only source. The Buddhist and Jain literatures of the succeeding period form a valuable supplement and corrective to the evidence of the Puranas, and isolated references in other literary works, even grammatical texts, have proved to be very important historical data. For the later period, beginning with the Guptas, we have no texts like the Puranas giving even bare dynastic lists. But although Indian literature practically ignores the history of the long period of 1000 years that follow, it does not altogether cease to be of help. Apart from isolated references scattered in the vast mass of literature of all types, we have two classes of works that contribute directly to our knowledge of history: viz., biographies and local chronicles. It is fortunate that certain writers took the lives of their royal patrons as the theme of their literary works. Banabhatta, that great master of Sanskrit prose, wrote the Harsha Charita, Life of the Emperor Harsha, and two poets, Vakpati and Bilhana, described the exploits of Yasovarman and Vikramaditya of the later Chalukya dynasty in two epics, the Gaudavaho and the Vikramanka Deva Charita. We have also a curious poetical work, the Rama Charita, in which the author uses throughout verses of double entendre, which, taken one way, describe the story of the Ramayana, and taken the other way, recount the story of King Ramapala of Bengal. Among other biographical works may be mentioned the Kumarapala Charita of Jayasima, Kumarapala Charita or Divyasraya Kavya of Hemachandra, Hamira Kavya of Nayachandra, Navasahasanka Charita of Padmagupta, Bojaprabandha by Balala, Prithviraja Charita of Chandbardai, and Prithviraja Vijaya, fragmentary, by an anonymous writer. These and other works of the same class cannot be regarded as genuine history, although they contain valuable historical information. Their object was the glorification of the king rather than to give a true picture of his life and times, and they were mostly conceived by their authors not as historical texts, but primarily as mediums for showing their literary skill and ingenuity. Among the local chronicles, the most famous is the Rajatarangini. It is a history of Kashmir, written throughout in verse by Kalhana in AD 1149-50. This is the only work in ancient Indian literature that may be regarded as an historical text in the true sense of the word. The author has not only taken great pains to collect his material from the existing chronicles and other sources, but at the beginning of his work, he has laid down a few general principles for writing history, which are remarkable as being far in advance of his age. Indeed, they may be regarded as anticipating to a large extent the critical method of historical research which was not fully developed till the 19th century AD. In view of the lamentable paucity of historical talent in ancient India, it is worthwhile quoting a few of Kalhana's observations, showing the high level which the Indian intellect had attained even in this much neglected sphere of activity. Regarding the strict impartiality to be observed by an historian, Kalhana remarks that virtuous poet alone is worthy of praise who, free from love or hatred, ever restricts his language to the exposition of facts. Danwan 7. As to the method of collecting data, we may quote the following verses among others. Abanman 14:15. I have examined 11 works of former scholars which contain the chronicles of the kings, as well as the views of the sage Nila Purana. By the inspection of ordinances, sasana, of former kings relating to religious foundations and grants, laudatory inscriptions, prasasti patra, as well as written records, sastra, all wearisome error has been set at rest. In spite of his excellent equipment and high ideals, Kalhana was unable to reconstruct the early history of Kashmir, for his enthusiasm and industry could not make up for the lack of authentic material. His account of the period before the 7th century AD cannot be regarded as trustworthy, and it becomes more and more unreliable as we go back to more ancient periods. Nevertheless, his attempt was creditable, and it is refreshing to find that he alone, of all Indian writers, has preserved some accounts of such forgotten Indian rulers as Kanishka. From the 7th century AD, however, the Rajatarangini may be regarded as a reliable history of Kashmir. The author narrates the career of each king in chronological order with a fair amount of detail, showing scrupulous impartiality in his criticism of men and events, and exhibiting soundness of judgment and healthy liberality in his general expression of views. As he gradually comes nearer his own age, the history becomes fuller and more replete with interesting accounts of men and things. It ceases to be merely a chronicle of dry details and faithfully presents the ebb and flow of national life, the periods of glory and misery, and the greatness and weakness of men and rulers. In short, all those minute details which make history a record of intense human interest, faithfully portraying the march of events through which a people works out its own destiny. We close the book with a poignant regret that we do not possess such a history for the whole of India, or many more texts of the same kind dealing with other parts of the country. Kalhana's example was not lost upon his countrymen, and several writers of Kashmir continued his chronicle. Jonaraja, who died in AD 1459, imitated Kalhana's style and brought the historical narrative up to the reign of Zainul Abidin. The Jaina Rajatarangini by his pupil Srivara covers the period AD 1459–86. Then came Prajabhatta and his pupil Sukha, who carried on the history till a few years after the conquest of Kashmir by Akbar. These later works are, however, much inferior to the Rajatarangini, both in literary style and in historical accuracy. Next to Kashmir, reference may be made to a large number of chronicles of Gujarat. These include well-known works like Rasmala, Kirtikaumudi of Somasvara, Sukrita Samkirtana of Arisimha, Prabandha Chintamani by Merutunga, Prabandha Kosa by Rajasekhara, Hamira Madamardana and Vastupala Tejapala Prasasti of Jayasimha, Sukrita Kirti Kalolini of Udaya Prabha, Vasanta Vilasa of Balachandra, etc., which are treasure houses of stories and fables as well as historical anecdotes. The two biographies of Kumarapala referred to above, and these chronicles enable us to trace the history of Gujarat, especially under the Chaulukyas, with fullness of details such as is not possible in the case of any other kingdom in ancient India except Kashmir. There were probably local chronicles of Sindh, which formed the basis of an Arabic history, of which we possess a Persian translation, the Chashnama, composed at the beginning of the 13th century AD. It gives a detailed account of the Arab conquest of Sindh and briefly refers to its history during the previous century. We have also local chronicles of Nepal, which merely contain a list of kings and the duration of their reigns, with only a few details here and there. The earlier portion of these Vamsavali, as they are called, is purely mythical, but there seems to be an historical basis for the accounts relating to the period commencing from the 1st century AD. The list is not, however, carefully compiled. There are wide divergences between the different chronicles, and many details are proved to be wrong by epigraphic evidence. These chronicles were never worked into historical texts by a genius of the type of Kalhana, and although in the absence of other sources they supply the framework for the history of Nepal, they cannot be regarded as a satisfactory substitute for real and genuine history. The existence of historical chronicles in Kashmir, Gujarat, Sindh, and Nepal supports the presumption that the archives of different states, as a rule, contained such royal chronicles, as stated by Hwayant-sang. These chronicles, unless raised to the status of a literary work of the type of Rajatarangini, or included in pretentious or sacred works like the Puranas, are not likely to long survive the fortunes of the dynasty whose history they recorded. This probably accounts for their general destruction, though a few have been preserved in outlying places like Kashmir, Gujarat, Nepal, and Assam in a later period. B. Archaeology. If we had to depend on literary sources alone, we would have known very little indeed of the history of India for the 1,000 years that elapsed since the fall of the Andhras in the 3rd century AD. Our knowledge of this period would have been even much less than that of the 1,000 years preceding it. Fortunately, the gap has been filled by the actual remains of this ancient period in the shape of coins, inscriptions, and monuments. They have enabled us to reconstruct an outline of the history of the period, which, vague and imperfect though it is, forms the only sure foundation on which the history of India will have to be built up in future. Indian archaeology is a science of recent growth and is barely a century old. Its pioneers were a few enterprising European scholars who took a deep interest in the antiquities of India and made an earnest effort to unravel her past. The origin and progress of this fascinating labor of love, which culminated in organized departments of research and exploration, achieving wonderful results, has been reviewed in the next chapter. Here, we may merely tabulate these results by way of indicating their bearing on the history of India. 1. Inscriptions. Inscriptions have proved a source of the highest value for the reconstruction of the political history of ancient India. Being engraved on stone and metal, they are free from the process of tampering to which books or other documents written on perishable materials are liable. Their value as contemporary documents thus remains unimpeachable. Although not always dated, the character of the script enables us to determine their approximate age. Thus, as historical evidence, they take precedence over the mass of literature, as the age of most of the texts is uncertain, and they all must have undergone considerable modifications in the course of being preserved in copies through hundreds of years. Apart from these considerations, the nature of many of these inscriptions invests them with a high degree of historical importance. The series of Indian inscriptions opens with the memorable edicts of the great Maurya Emperor Asoka, engraved on rocks and pillars throughout his vast empire, from beyond the Indus in the west to the Mysore Plateau in the south. These are royal proclamations and commandments, mostly in his own words, and convey across 22 centuries the life and personality of a great man and a great ruler with a striking vividness to which there is hardly any parallel in the history of the world. It is either the strangest freak of nature or the rare good fortune of India, if not a divine dispensation, that in the midst of an almost wholesale destruction of historical materials of the period, one fragment alone should have been spared, so faithfully reflecting that spiritual greatness which constitute the glory of Indian civilization and its special characteristic. The records of Asoka form a class by themselves and contribute largely to our knowledge of the history of the period and the spirit that animated one of the greatest men that ever sat on a royal throne. No other inscriptions make even a near approach to them in point of interest or historical importance. One form of alphabet is used in all these records, excepting two groups in the northwest, which are written in an altogether different script. The latter, known as Kharoshthi, was obviously derived from Aramaic and, like the Semitic alphabet, was written from right to left. It continued in use in the northwestern corner of India for many centuries, but vanished, without leaving any trace behind. The script in which all the other inscriptions of Asoka were written is known as Brahmi and is written from left to right. It is the earliest form of Indian writing known to us, and from it have been derived, by slow evolution through ages, all the Indian characters current today, including Tamil, Telugu, and Kannades. When the records of Asoka first came to notice towards the close of the 18th century, their script was as much an enigma to all as in the 14th century AD, when the Emperor Firuz Tughlaq brought a pillar with Asoka's inscription to Delhi and made a vain attempt to have it read by the Indian Pandits. The deciphering of the Asokan inscriptions by Prinsep, described in detail in the next chapter, is one of the romances of archaeology comparable to those associated with the discovery of the clue to the hieroglyphics and cuneiform writings. It was accomplished in AD 1837, and in course of the next 50 years, Indian epigraphy was placed on a firm footing. By the devoted and patient labor of a number of scholars, the different types of Indian scripts were thoroughly studied, analyzed, and classified, and a scientific basis laid down for Indian paleography, which has made it possible to correlate them to different ages and localities. Apart from their intrinsic interest as historical records, the Asokan inscriptions have thus proved of great value as the starting point of epigraphic and paleographic studies in India. The inscriptions of the post-Asokan period may be broadly divided into two classes: official and private. The official records are in most cases either prasastis, i.e., eulogies of kings written by their court poets, or land grants. The most famous example of the former is furnished by the long record of Samudra Gupta engraved on an Asokan pillar, now in the Allahabad fort. It describes in great detail the personal qualities and the military achievements of the great Gupta emperor and forms the chief document of his memorable reign. The age of the imperial Guptas is now justly regarded as the golden age of India, but all memories of it, and even the very name of Samudragupta, the Indian Napoleon who laid the foundations of the Gupta Empire, were lost to Indian tradition. The Allahabad Prasasti has preserved from oblivion the name and fame of this great hero and, along with a number of other inscriptions, forms the main basis of our knowledge of the Gupta period. The Gwalior Prasasti of Boja has similarly thrown a flood of light on the imperial Pratiharas, another forgotten dynasty of ancient India. Among other Prasastis supplying valuable historical information may be mentioned that of King Vijaya Sena of the Sena dynasty of Bengal, engraved on a slab of stone found at Deopara. Its nominal object is to record the building of a temple by Vijaya Sena, but it is almost wholly devoted to a panegyric of the great king, recording his victories and achievements in the most high-flown language. The eye-hole inscription of Pulakesin II, the Chalukya king, belongs to exactly the same type. By far the largest number of official documents are charters conveying the sale or gift of lands. These are mostly engraved on copper plates, though in very rare instances they are also found on stone pillars and in temples. These charters define the boundaries of the lands and specify the object and conditions of the grant, often enumerating other interesting details such as the price of land, the mode of its measurement, exhortations to future kings not to confiscate the grants, and quotations from the scriptures threatening severe punishment after death for those who violate the grants in any way. Interesting though these details are in many ways, they do not contain much that is of historical importance, but by a formal convention, fortunately followed in many if not in all cases, these charters begin with a sort of royal prasasti which gives a short account of the donor's family for several generations, and describes in greater detail the life and achievements of the ruling king. These formal and introductory portions in the land grants have supplied us with invaluable historical material. Sometimes, as in the Chola inscriptions, this introductory part runs to a very great length and forms a valuable historical document by itself. Very often, this portion was wholly or partially stereotyped in the royal archives and used in several grants. Sometimes the portion was independently engraved on copper plates, and these were kept ready in the office, so that when occasion arose, only the details of the grant had to be added to make them formal charters. In short, this historical part had little organic connection with the grant itself, and may be regarded as a prasasti prefixed to it. These prasastis were composed by court poets or other royal officials, and one would naturally hesitate to take them at their face value. There is undoubtedly a great deal of exaggeration in the effusions of the poets. It is customary for them to endow their patron kings with all the ideal virtues and to represent them as the rulers of the whole world, girdled by the four oceans. Such general expressions must be discarded as of no historical value, but greater value attaches to the specific enumerations of campaigns, victories, and conquests, for these documents were public property, and their authors would be justly exposed to ridicule if they had made categorical statements without any basis whatsoever. Of course, they were expected to exaggerate the achievements of their masters, but even such exaggeration implies a substratum of fact. A great deal of caution is therefore needed to assess the proper value of the claims made on behalf of a king, and they should be checked by all possible means. Such checks are furnished by the statements made on behalf of the rival kings, and sometimes welcome corroboration is afforded by independent evidence. In cases where the inscriptions are engraved on rocks or objects not easily portable, their find spots become of great importance as indicating the territorial jurisdiction of the king. Sometimes the records of vassal chiefs and finds of coins corroborate the claims of territorial conquests. By these and other means, it is almost always possible to make legitimate inferences from these documents about the achievements of the kings. The official documents, however, form only a very small proportion of the inscriptions. By far, the larger majority are private records. They cover a wide range, from a short votive inscription of 2 or 3 words to pompous poetical compositions glorifying an individual or family. They throw light on various aspects of society, even where they do not directly contribute to political history. A good many are engraved on images of gods and religious buildings, recording pious donations. These constitute the chief means of fixing the dates of these images and buildings, and have been of incalculable help in tracing the evolution of art and religion and determining their general condition in any specified period. Similarly, the language and style of the inscriptions have been of immense value to the linguistic and literary history of India. The evidence of the inscriptions taken in mass is unerring in these respects. If we analyze, for example, the 1500 or more inscriptions prior to the Gupta age that have so far come to light, we find an overwhelmingly large number, more than 95%, written in Prakrit and concerned with non-Brahmanical religious sects, mainly Buddhist and Jain. The proportion is almost just the reverse in favor of the Sanskrit language and the Brahmanical religion, if we take the inscriptions of the period subsequent to the Gupta age. Even allowing for all accidental factors, this one fact betokens a sweeping change in the life of the people, both in respect of the religious ideas and the medium of literary expression. These inscriptions also throw important light on political history. Many of them refer to ruling kings otherwise unknown, and some of them even supply dates, either in regnal years or in a specified or unspecified era. This has been a prolific source of the constant addition to our historical knowledge, though where supplementary evidence is lacking, we know little more than the royal name, his approximate date, and the location of his kingdom. But even such scraps of information, pieced together, have enabled the historian to reconstruct a clear outline of the history of a locality or even of a definite period, of which little was known before. In a few cases, the private records throw more direct light on the political history of India as they emanate from persons closely connected with the royal family. We have, for example, interesting records of families whose members for generations held high offices like ministers or generals. In others, the importance of an individual is indicated by the office he held or the part he played in the affairs of state. These inscriptions, though issued by or in honor of private individuals, therefore incidentally give us a great deal of information about the kings and political condition of the time. On the whole, it may be said without any hesitation that the epigraphic records of ancient India have been the principal source of our information regarding the political history, and have also proved to be of great value by supplementing literary evidence in regard to the social, religious, and economic condition of India. 2. Numismatics. Next to the inscriptions, coins are the most important source of the history of ancient India. Many thousands of these have come to light. Hoards have been unearthed in different parts of the country, a single hoard sometimes yielding many thousands, and individual specimens have constantly been found on or near the surface of ancient sites. Most of them at first passed into the hands of private individuals, but a number were recovered by scholars or acquired by public institutions. There is no doubt, however, that quite a large proportion was melted or otherwise lost to antiquarian study, and this deplorable state of things is unfortunately still going on. A systematic study and collection of coins has been possible only in cases of regular archaeological excavations. Not only were many coins otherwise acquired lost to us, but no systematic record has been kept of the provenance of those which have survived. This has been a serious handicap to the scientific study of the coinage, as much of the historical importance of a coin is lost if we cannot determine the exact locality of which it formed the currency. The importance of numismatics for the study of the economic condition of a country is too obvious to need a detailed consideration. Here we shall only indicate how coins have helped us to reconstruct the political history of the various periods. The earliest coins of India bear only figures, devices, or symbols, but with few exceptions, no legends. These coins were sometimes cast in dies, but more often the symbols were punched on the metallic pieces. Sometimes there are many symbols punched at different times. They were most probably deliberately stamped by the issuing authority in order to guarantee their genuineness and value. These authorities might have been kings or states, but also certainly included individual merchants, trade guilds, city corporations, and similar bodies, for the idea of a state monopoly of minting coins was yet unknown. In the absence of legends, it is impossible to allot the different coins to these different categories. The meaning of the figures and symbols, once familiar to the people using these coins, is no longer clear to us, though some of them are familiar objects or well-known conventional designs. Various suggestions have been made regarding their significance, but they are highly speculative and rest on no secure foundations. Apart from conveying some vague religious ideas and artistic conventions, these coins do not supply any historical information. The rare legends on them refer to the mercantile corporations which issued them. It is not till after the Greek invasion that we come across coins with the names of kings clearly engraved on them. Excepting perhaps a few coins of the time of Alexander, the most important series of such coins were those issued by the Greek rulers of Bactria, who ultimately conquered the Punjab and northwestern frontier. The artistic excellence of these coins has never been surpassed in India, and the portraits of kings and other figures on them show Hellenistic art at its best. These coins of the Greco-Bactrians set a new fashion and may be said to have revolutionized Indian numismatics. The most important feature added to Indian coins from this time forward was the name, and sometimes even the portrait, of the sovereign who issued them. How greatly it has helped our knowledge of political history will be apparent from the fact that it is from these coins alone that we know of nearly 30 Greek kings and queens who ruled in India. The classical writers have referred to only 4 or 5 of them, but not only were the names of the rest unknown to them, but even the very memory of the Greek domination over a corner of India for nearly 2 centuries was absolutely lost. This remarkable historical episode, interesting alike to Greece and India, came to the knowledge of the world after nearly 2,000 years, by the discovery of those fine series of coins of gold, silver, and copper, which now adorn many public museums in Europe and India. The coinage of the Greeks was imitated by the Scythian and Parthian invaders who followed in their footsteps, and although the execution of their coins is far inferior, they are equally important for historical purposes. Here, too, the coins alone have enabled us to reconstruct an outline of their history and recover the names of quite a large number of their rulers. One branch of the Scythian invaders, who settled permanently in Gujarat and the Kathiawar Peninsula, issued coins which not only gave the name of the ruling king and that of his father, but very often also the date in the well-known Saka era. This has enabled us to reconstruct the history of the Western satraps, as these rulers are called, for a period of more than 300 years. With the exception of a few inscriptions and literary references which otherwise would have been of little help, the coins have been the sole source of our information regarding the Greeks, the Sakas, and the Parthians that entered India after the dissolution of the Mauryan Empire. The Kushanas who followed them likewise issued a large number of coins, but the history of this dynasty is also known from other sources. The coins have also been the principal source of our information regarding the various Indian states, both monarchical and republican, that flourished during the same period. Most of them, like the Mallavas, Yaudayas, the Mitra rulers of Panchala, etc., are almost exclusively known from their coins. In other cases, like the Satavahanas of the Deccan, the Puranic account is corroborated, corrected, and supplemented by their coins and inscriptions. The Guptas, who founded the greatest empire in India after the Mauryas, issued a large variety of fine coins. Although we know a great deal of their history from epigraphic records, the coins form an important additional source of information. With the downfall of the Guptas, the numismatic evidence ceases to be an important source of history. Isolated coins, here and there, have no doubt proved to be of great value, but they seldom afford us material information not otherwise available. It is a curious fact that coins of even great emperors like Harsha or ruling dynasties like the Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, Pratiharas, and Palas, not to speak of lesser kings and dynasties, are either unknown or of little significance. 3. Monuments. In addition to coins and inscriptions, we have other antiquarian remains, such as buildings or parts thereof, statues of stone or metal, terracotta, ornamental and decorative fragments, pottery, and various other objects of a miscellaneous character. They are of great importance in tracing the history and evolution of Indian art. The art of a country is generally regarded to be a fair index of its culture, and it throws light on some higher aspects of its civilization which cannot be easily understood from other sources. The remains of Indian monuments have thus considerably helped towards a proper appreciation of the life and spirit of ancient India. In addition to individual monuments, sometimes we have the vast remains of an ancient city laid bare before us. Some of them, like those of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, have opened before us an altogether new type of civilization, reaching back to an age of which no memorials in India were known before. This has carried back the antiquity of Indian culture and civilization by several thousands of years and opened up a new vista of its history, character, and association with the outside world. It has also transformed our ideas of the origin of Indian civilization. We can no longer derive from the simple fact of the Aryan migration the complex structure of later Indian civilization, but must look for more than one source which fed the mighty stream. even in concrete matters, our ideas have undergone great changes. As an instance may be cited the origin of the Brahmi script used in the Asokan records, which, as noted above, is the parent stock from which all Indian alphabets have been derived. Scholars have almost unanimously held the view that Brahmi was derived from a foreign source, though they widely differ about its identity. But more than 500 seals have been discovered at Mohenjo-daro, which contain a species of pictorial writing. This has not been deciphered yet, but the probability of the Brahmi alphabet being derived from it is now being seriously considered. Similarly, the deep-rooted conviction that Indian art originated from a foreign source not much earlier than the 3rd century BC has been considerably shaken by the discovery at Mohenjo-daro of finely carved stone figures of the 3rd millennium BC, which would not unfavorably compare with the statues of the classical period in Athens. The archaeological excavation of the Indus Valley is still at its infancy, and we may look forward to its continuation as opening up a brilliant chapter of Indian history as yet unknown or even undreamt of. Coming down to historical times, the systematic excavations of ancient sites like the city of Taxila or the monastic establishments at Sanath, near Benares, have thrown light upon various aspects of life of which there is little or no record in literature. Such excavations, as will be noted in the next chapter, have been few and far between. Still, meager though they are, compared with the vast extent of the country, these archaeological excavations have enabled us to realize some interesting aspects of Indian civilization which would have been otherwise unknown. In addition to literature and archaeological remains, we have another interesting source of information in the accounts left by foreign writers. The earliest among them are the 2 Greek writers, Herodotus and Ctesias, both of whom must have derived their information indirectly through Persian sources. Herodotus gives some useful information along with a great deal of fairy tales, but the account of Ctesias largely consists of incredible fables. Far greater interest attaches to the writings of those Greeks who accompanied Alexander to India, and the account of Megasthenes, who lived for some time in the court of Chandragupta Maurya as an ambassador of Seleucus. Though these works are mostly lost, much has been preserved in books based upon them, written by later authors. These accounts contain a great deal of information that is both interesting and authentic, but they suffer from the defects inherent in the writings of foreigners, ignorant of the language and customs of the country. While great importance naturally attaches to what they recorded from personal observation, we must treat with great reserve their accounts based on others' reports or hearsay evidence. Due allowance must also be made for the necessarily limited circle within which a Greek must have moved in India, and his natural proneness to see everything through Hellenic eyes and distort or exaggerate anything that was strange or unfamiliar to him. It would be foolish to belittle the importance of the classical accounts of India, but it would be equally unwise to put implicit faith in everything contained in them. Special reference must be made to the classical writers who have elucidated the geography and natural history of India. The earliest of them is the anonymous author of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. He was a Greek settled in Egypt who made a voyage to the Indian coast about AD 80 and left a record of its ports, harbors, and merchandise. This short account, full of interesting information, is worth its weight in gold, as it has preserved from oblivion a phase of the trade and maritime activity in ancient India, otherwise unknown. Ptolemy wrote a geographical account of India in the 2nd century AD, on scientific lines. His data being derived from secondary sources, he has fallen into numerous errors, and his general conception of the shape of India is also faulty in the extreme. Nevertheless, the attempt was praiseworthy and has supplied valuable information. The same may be said of Pliny's account of Indian animals, plants, and minerals written in the 1st century AD. There were also many other writers of a later date. These classical accounts, most of which have been translated into English by J.W. McCrindle, were generally prompted by a spirit of exploration of unknown lands, and reflect great credit on their authors and the scientific spirit of the age in which they lived. The same spirit was displayed a few centuries later by Arab sailors and merchants, some of whom, like Sulaiman and al-Masudi, have left brief records of India. The gap in the interval between the two periods is filled by Chinese writers, both chroniclers at home and pilgrims who visited India. The writings of the Chinese travelers to India form a valuable supplement to the classical accounts. Three of them, Fa Hien, 5th century AD, Huan Tsang, and Aitzing, 7th century AD, are better known than others and have recorded their experiences in fairly bulky volumes, which are happily preserved in their original forms and have been translated into English. All three spent a number of years in India and learnt its language, and the first two traveled widely, almost all over the country. In these respects, they had an undoubted advantage over the Greek travelers. But unfortunately for the historian of India, these eminent Chinese visitors were all devout Buddhist monks, whose journey to India was merely a pilgrimage to holy lands, and whose outlook was purely religious. Neither Fa Hien nor Aitzing refer to secular matters, except very incidentally, nor do they even mention the name of the king or kings whose dominions were visited by them. Huan Tsang is not so circumscribed, but gives some interesting information about his royal patron Harshavardhana and other contemporary kings of India. He also briefly refers to the political condition of the kingdoms through which he passed, and devotes an entire chapter to a general account of India. These are, no doubt, very valuable, but they form only a very small part of his extensive records, which, like those of Fa Hien and Aitzing, are otherwise devoted to a minute and detailed description of Buddhism in Mysore, India, its rituals and practices, sanctuaries and memorials, sects and doctrines, scriptures and traditions. The Chinese travelers have rendered a great service by depicting the state of Buddhism in India, but devout pilgrims as they were, their intense religious faith impaired to a certain extent their rational instincts and power of impartial observation. We must therefore be on our guard against accepting as literally true all their statements, especially those which concern the Buddhist faith in any way, even when based on personal observation. Their judgment on men and things was warped, if not vitiated, by an absolute and implicit faith in the superiority of Buddhism, and the too intimate, if not exclusive, association with men and institutions connected with that religion. Buddhism alone loomed large in their eyes, everything else taking a subordinate and almost an insignificant place. Such an attitude is hardly compatible with recording an account that may be regarded as strictly historical. From the 8th century, AD India attracted the attention of the Arab writers. Apart from the account of the Arab merchants and sailors, the Indian borderland finds prominent mention in Arab historical chronicles on account of the political aggrandizement of that militant nation which culminated in the conquest of Sind early in the 8th century AD. 2.5 centuries later, the Ghaznavid Turks followed in the footsteps of the Arabs, and carried the banner of Islam far into the interior of India. India now figured prominently in the Muslim chronicles. The best foreign account of India that this age produced was written by Abu Rihan, better known as Al-Biruni, a contemporary of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. While the ruthless conqueror was harrying India by fire and sword, destroying and plundering its cities and temples, the great Arabic scholar engaged himself in studying the culture and civilization of the country. He learned Sanskrit and studied its different branches of literature. The bulky volume which he wrote is in many respects the most rational and comprehensive account of India ever written by a foreigner until modern times. He is singularly free from religious enthusiasm, bordering on fanaticism, and the racial superiority complex which mark the Muslim writings of the age. He patiently labored hard to acquire knowledge of Indian society and culture in a laudable spirit of quest for truth, and brought to his task a liberal and rational mind, enriched by profound knowledge, remarkable for his age. But from the point of view of Indian history, Al-Biruni's great work, highly valuable though it is, suffers from two serious defects. In the first place, he says little or nothing of the political condition of India. Secondly, his account rests primarily on his study of Indian literature and is not based on personal observations. In other words, he saw India not with his own eyes, but through literary works. Al-Biruni gives an admirable survey of the mathematics, physics, chemistry, cosmogony, cosmology, geography, astronomy, and the allied sciences, philosophy, religious rites, customs, social ideas, etc. of India. But we feel at almost every step, and he does not conceal the fact that he is merely reproducing what he read about these things in books written by Indian authors dead and gone long ago, and draws little or no inspiration from the living India of his age. 2. The medieval period, 13th to 18th century. Al-Biruni's work closes a long series of accounts written by foreigners about ancient India. 2 centuries later, the Muslim Turks established their political supremacy over India and introduced the art of compiling chronicles, recording the political events of the country. The earliest work of this kind, Tabaqat-i-Nasiri by Minhajuddin, composed in the middle of the 13th century AD, traces the history of Muslim rule in India from the very beginning with such fullness of detail as the author could derive from a patient study of all the materials available to him. It was followed by other works at regular intervals, among which the following deserve special mention. Tariq-i-Firuz Shahi by Zia-ud-Din Barani and Shamsi Siraj Afif. Gulshani Ibrahimi by Muhammad Qasim Firishta. Aini Akbari and Akbarnama by Abul Fazl. Tabaqati Akbari by Nizam-ud-Din Ahmad and Muntakhabut Tawarik by Abdul Qadir Budauni. There are besides a number of other works dealing with general history, as well as provincial states or particular individuals. A fair idea of the nature and extent of these works may be had from that excellent compendium, The History of India as Told by Its Own Historians, compiled by Eliot and Dowson, in which an attempt has been made to cover the history of the whole period by extracts, in an English translation, from indigenous historical texts. The autobiographies of the Mughal emperors Babur and Jahangir, and the biographies of other emperors, kings, and various grandees form a valuable supplement to regular historical works. A part of the official correspondence, both of the central government and of the various provinces and subordinate states, has also been preserved. Official dispatches, or the letters of military commanders, governors, and diplomatic agents are valuable sources of information and often give accurate dates and details not available from any other source. Mention may also be made of court diaries and news reports. These contain reports of the occurrences and sayings at the public durbars of Delhi and provincial courts, which were taken down by men specially employed for the purpose by subordinate rulers or important officials. These form valuable materials for the reconstruction of the history of the period, and the monumental work Aini Akbari gives a most detailed and comprehensive picture of the complex administrative machinery set up by the great Mughal emperor. The bardic chronicles of the Rajputs form an important class of historical documents concerning the Hindu states of Rajputana. It is unnecessary to dwell at length on these familiar sources of history, as they will be reviewed in detail in later parts of this work. The archaeological evidence of the period, highly valuable from the point of view of the history of art, ceases to be of as much special importance as in the ancient period for the purpose of political history. The coins of the early rulers with their dates and mint marks, as well as inscriptions, often supply valuable additional information, particularly in respect of provincial history, which is not so fully dealt with by the court historians. But they are at best valuable supplements and save, in rare instances, not the sole or even principal sources of information. The accounts of foreign travelers are also an important, though supplementary source for the history of this period. One of the earliest is Marco Polo, who visited India and other parts of Asia towards the close of the 13th century AD. He does not, however, tell us much of the political history. The most important in this respect is Ibn Battuta, an African Mohammedan who spent several years in the court of Muhammad Tughlaq. He returned to his native country in AD 1349 after 25 years of travel, full of adventures in various parts of Asia. He has left a vivid account of India of his time, whose general accuracy there is no reason to dispute. Another important traveler was Niccolo de Conti, the Venetian, in the 15th century. A number of other European travelers in the 15th and 16th centuries have left interesting information about various parts of India, particularly the powerful kingdom of Vijayanagar. For the Mughal period, the voluminous writings of European travelers, including reports of Jesuit missionaries and official dispatches of the Portuguese, French, and English trading settlements, supply a mass of authentic information. For the second period, AD 1200-1800, therefore, the historian of India is no longer hampered by lack of material as in the first or earlier period. He can trace the main outline of the political history with essential details and has not to piece together fragmentary data from coins and inscriptions by a tedious and laborious process. His principal difficulty is to sift the truth from a mass of data which sometimes contradict one another, and to assess correctly the statements of historians which are not infrequently colored by passions and prejudices. But these are difficulties which are common to historians of all ages and countries. 3. The modern period. It is unnecessary to say much on the materials for the history of the modern period, as they present no unusual features. It should be emphasized, however, that state papers, eons and contemporary official documents, now take the chief place among these materials, as in the case of European countries. Such state papers are not altogether wanting for the Mughal period, but they are, comparatively speaking, few in number and play a minor role in the construction of the history of the period. From the 18th century, they increase in volume and importance, and the Peshwa's Daftars may be cited as a striking example. With the establishment of the British ascendancy, these state papers form the most elaborate and valuable source of information. The servants of the East India Company in India had to keep very detailed written records of their transactions and deliberations for the perusal of their masters in England, and this fortunate circumstance has undoubtedly increased the mass of documents which supply abundant historical material of first-rate importance. The correspondence of the various Indian states among themselves and with the British is also very valuable. These materials have been partially lost, but a great deal has been preserved and is now kept in the Imperial Records Office in Delhi and the India Office in London. The Records Office in Delhi has been recently reorganized, and proper arrangements have been made for making the records available to students of history and helping their study by means of classification, indexing, and printing select documents. Numbers of important state papers in provincial record offices, Indian states, and in private possession are also gradually coming to light. These and other materials, to which detailed reference will be made in due course, have considerably facilitated the task of the historian of modern India. Dear friends, this was the chapter Sources of Indian History from the book History and Culture of Indian People, Volume 1, The Vedic Age. In the next episode, join us for the chapter number 3, General Review of Archaeological Explorations and Excavations. Goodbye for now. Thank you for listening.